So, yeah, thanks again to the Behave Stockholm group, to Jerome, who actually made the introduction. Very happy to speak here tonight. So my name is Craig Watson. That's my Twitter handle, CDC Watson. If you're interested in having a chat after this talk, please connect with me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, which is more in the startup space, and then I'm going to talk through some of the learnings we've had, and then how we've moved into Spotify, some of the challenges we've had at Spotify, and some of the interesting pieces with the scale that we have there. And then in terms of the title, why I said I think behavioural insights are sometimes 2020 in hindsight is because it'd be very easy for me to say, oh, we had this magic project where we came up from the start and we said we knew exactly how that was going to work. But the reality is often in retrospect we look back and we think this actual feature worked probably because of these behavioural insights or because of these behavioural pieces that were applied. But I think that's okay because it means you can apply those learnings to other projects when you see them actually work or not. So that's the idea. Hopefully you'll get a flavour of that today. So in 2016, January 2016, Soundwave was a company I co-founded, was acquired by Spotify. And so you might hear the Dublin accent. It's getting worse the longer I spend in Sweden, which is the inverse of what you'd expect. But we were a team of like 12 people in Dublin that built out this company over the course of 4 years. And basically what we built was a social music graph. So it was like an Instagram for your music. You could follow your friends, you could speak with them, you could send messages, and it was a great journey. Classic startup, lots of highs, lots of lows, but thankfully we had a good ending. And I've spent the last 2 years working as kind of one of the product leads in the growth organization in Spotify and trying to build out their growth features. In terms of like the behavioral economics piece, I think I had like a light bulb moment, probably like Jerome's had and other people as well. But for me, I actually can remember I was in college and I came across Freakonomics. I'm sure most of you have heard of it, or probably a lot of you have read it. And I just remember thinking it was that Dunning, I can't pronounce it, but basically the realization that I was way too overconfident, right? And there was all these cognitive biases in my thinking that I probably hadn't actually applied to some of the learnings that I thought I had. So I started this website, and I think that's how we connected, myself and Jerome. And the idea was to try and map out some of these biases that we see some of the best growth companies apply. So Duolingo, Pyro is a music app, Calm is like a meditation app. And just thinking about it from first principles, really distilling down why are these products working. It's not the UX, not the tech. A lot of the cases it's actually just really smart behavioral science driving the product. And often that's by accident, but still it's one of the reasons why it's working. So I'm now kind of focused a lot on the onboarding side within Spotify. And if you think about a funnel, when people join up, so we have 140 million active users, massive user base, and we get a huge amount of users through the door every day. But like every funnel, there's stages, and like every business where they drop out of that funnel. And the onboarding piece is right at the start, so that's also where we need to focus a little bit on how do we improve the user experience to keep them around longer. One, so they can get the most from the product and that they can consume from it. But from the business side, we need to be able to generate advertising revenue. We need to be able to convert people to premium, so the longer they stick around, the more likely they are to pay. User onboarding typically looks like this. Nobody wants to take responsibility from it. It's usually kind of this battle between product and marketing. It's quite woolly. It's kind of a grey area. It's very hard to know what exactly it should be. But there are some nice principles that you can apply to onboarding. So for me, this is actually taken from the Fogg model. How many raise a hand maybe if you've heard of the Fogg model? BJ Fogg is a few people. So he's a behavioral scientist based out of the US who's worked a lot on how do you look at user experience and how do you apply behavioral science to that user experience. And so onboarding is effectively the trigger to drive a target behavior by either increasing one ability or your motivation. And if you think about that, any product you interact with, is it easy to use and are you motivated to use it? Sounds maybe too simple, but actually when you look at a lot of the initiatives that work, you can frame them in this way. So we think about it in terms of there's a threshold where if you don't have high enough motivation on the y-axis or high enough ability on the x-axis, you're not going to actually complete that behavior. And it's from an onboarding side, we are the trigger, so we're trying to get people to complete those behaviors, and we have to increase the ability and increase the motivation. So it's something along these lines, trying to bring up the status quo of all the users that come into the product. But I think for this particular talk, it's more interesting to talk about motivation, right? Because this is what we're probably mostly interested in. And I think one of the ones that we touched on was like authority bias, right? So a lot of people in the room here are businesses, you've got brands, like how do you think about your own authority bias? How do you actually lean on that to drive home a message? It's basically our tendency to follow experts and follow their advice and do things we might not be predisposed to do in the absence of such an authoritative figure. And so in our case, actually we drive a lot of users towards playlist curation. And you might ask, oh, how does that fit in? Well, the mere fact of you creating a playlist has a load of like sub-biases within it, that you have this what's known as the IKEA effect, where you build something you feel like, if you build the most horrible set of shelves, but you've put in 3 hours to build them, you probably look at them quite fondly, right? It's no different with music. If you build a playlist that is maybe for your wedding playlist or for a road trip, you're more likely to feel like that sense of ownership is giving value to the product. And so we know that by driving people to create playlists, we can increase retention across the entire product. And we run thousands of experiments every year, not just on this feature, but much to what Christina was saying, we have like this A/B testing framework, and we're pretty impartial to it. We'll just try different ideas. We'll make it easier to create playlists. We'll make it harder. We'll try the different visualizations of how we'd put them. We just stack and see which features work, and then take those learnings and apply them into the next test, and then ship those at scale. So contrast bias, again, is quite difficult often in isolation to work out whether we want something as a product. But when we have two items compared to one another, it makes it a little bit easier to actually make that choice. And so an example of a successful test that we ran recently was if you sign up to Spotify on the website, what happens is a lot of times we were seeing that users were entering their details and then kind of were confused as to what the next step was. Were they supposed to go into the web player? Should they download the desktop app? Should they download the mobile app? Should they just go back to the website? And so we just made this really clear example of, okay, do you want to download desktop? If not, do you want to download the mobile app? And if not, continue to the web player. And the actual mere act of just contrasting those options, which they could have done in isolation by themselves, increased like by 10x the amount of registrations that we had through the funnels, which actually retain the most. So we want to drive people towards the client apps because they actually retain better than the web player. And just a small little change like that had a huge impact. Next one I want to talk a little bit about is just general incentive bias. Probably no surprises to this crowd. We underestimate the power of incentives though often, and I think even in a business perspective, there's a huge amount of optimization, so we can ensure that people who are hardwired to positive rewards can carry through with a behavior, and that we can get them to carry out a behavior. Good example here would be release radar. So this is an algorithmically generated set, so we basically don't have expert curators here. This is all driven by a machine learning model which looks at what you've been listening to, and then we can take the artists that you have been listening to, and then we look at what new releases those particular artists might have out. And so like on a weekly basis, we have every Friday we send out this release radar, and it's been a really, really successful feature, and the reason being that people there's a couple of things compounding here, but people really want to actually see like what is that new music. Like they're incentivized to check it out on a Friday, and it's probably one of the most the stickiest sets that we have in terms of music sets, because it has all these incentives. And one of the key things I think is that it's a variable reward as well, right? So exactly like a Facebook feed, when you scroll, it's basically just a big slot machine. That's kind of what you're doing every time you scroll. We've all done it. It's like Sunday night, midnight, you should be in bed, but you're just stuck on Facebook and you're scrolling through and you're bored. And it's that gambling mechanic, that the variable reward that's driving you. And exactly the same here. You don't know what songs are coming every week, so you're incentivized to come back and actually check out what those songs might be. Generally, liking, disliking bias. What I would say here in terms of consumer products is comes down to personalization. That's kind of the key piece. And so how do you personalize your product or your offering for the user in the cheapest way possible? And one of the ways that we do that is through what we call taste onboarding. And so before 2 years ago, there was no taste onboarding. Basically, you would come into Spotify, you would have to start listening to music. We don't then slowly start building up our listening graph of what you were into and what you didn't like. We introduced this taste onboarding a little while back, and it's had a huge impact on improving the recommendations in the model. So what music we actually suggest to people.